Well, joining me now to look at these early days of the new minority parliament are Susan Delacourt, she's Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Mia Rabson is a reporter with the Canadian Press, and Manon Cornellier is a columnist for Le Devoir. All three of you, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, we have to start with some very, very unfortunate news that we're hearing today, and that is from about Jim CARR, Minister Jim CARR, and his diagnosis with cancer. I wanted to start by getting your reaction and putting it maybe in a personal and a political context. I'll start with you, Mia, because you've dealt with Mr. CARR many times over the last years, and especially working in previous years with the Winnipeg Free Press. Your reactions?
I was stunned today, very, very sad. I mean, I've known him for many, many years, but I think the entire Liberal caucus, his staff, I mean, what a absolute devastating turn of events for them to come in, to win a seat again, coming back in, and then all of a sudden to be told that you're facing a life-threatening illness. So, you know, my heart goes out to them, and our thoughts are with him, and he's a fighter, and hopefully we see him back on the hill soon. Yeah,
and obviously we all wish him the best of luck as well. Susan, I mean, there's also the larger context too about what this does to the team right now. It's a very difficult time and a difficult development.
Yeah, it's not been an easy week for Liberals west of Ontario, and it's funny, you know, the Liberals were already feeling very sad about the loss of Ralph Goodale. You know that. Because, no offense to the younger folks, and no intent to be ageist, but the Jim CARR and Ralph Goodale are the senior voices. People often went to them for calm, you know, everybody, and I think everybody wants to stay calm right now too. Mm-hmm. So I hope he gets better very soon. I hope to see him back, and I'm gonna count on that. I wish him well too, but I think in the context of a Liberal Party that was already very sad about Ralph Goodale, this is also very sad.
Yeah, Manon, I mean, obviously the larger context too is that this opens up the larger discussion too about cabinet making, and one of the big challenges that the Prime Minister is going to have. First of all, well, he also has two people who are dealing with health issues, right? In Dominique LeBlanc on election day. Yeah. Dominique LeBlanc was in a Montreal hospital still receiving treatment for his form of cancer.
Yeah, so for Mr. Trudeau, it's complicated because he had to measure the workload he will give those two persons that were key in his previous cabinet, and I'm sure he wants to keep them, so we can just hope that they get better, that's for sure, and especially for Mr. CARR, who's from the West, and for Mr. Trudeau having quite a complex equation to resolve there. I don't think it's that's even a more complicated news for him.
And you open the door to the bigger question, and that is exactly it. Now, I know this is being belabored all week long, but at the week's end, we're still asking ourselves and scratching our heads and asking, how is the Prime Minister in cabinet making? We do have a date, November 20th. He will have the swearing in of the cabinet. How does he go about trying to deal with that lack of representation in Alberta and Saskatchewan? I leave it open to you.
Well, Jim CARR is actually a very big piece of that puzzle. I had heard he was the Natural Resources Minister originally in the Trudeau cabinet, and they were talking that they needed a Natural Resources Minister from the West. They can't pick from their multitudes of MPs in the East. They need to pick someone from the West, and a lot of people were pointing at him as possibly going back into that portfolio. I don't think they can do that now because they need somebody who can actually be very hands-on right now, and he obviously can't do that. And so then they also need then to find another person from Manitoba. They have to figure out how they're going to represent Alberta and Saskatchewan. It is not as easy as it was before for Pierre Trudeau and for others to turn to the Senate to fill that void because of the way that Mr. Trudeau has handled the Senate, now wanting it to be independent. So, I mean, these are all questions that he has to ask, and there's no easy answer for him.
Susan, weigh in. I mean, we're going to explore all of the options, and many of them, granted, are blue skying. I mean, we are not making the cabinet, and we are not making the rules by which Justin Trudeau will, you know, live in terms of determining his cabinet members, or the Senate that comes up as an issue.
So I will say Justin Trudeau has a more cabinet-style government than Stephen Harper did. But we should remember, too, that a lot of decisions in this government are made by the Prime Minister's office. So I would imagine over the next 4 weeks, what you're going to see is them bulking up in staff from the West inside that office. I think my view is that that's why it's taking 4 weeks as opposed to 2 weeks this time, is because first they want to deal with a change of staff or fixing things. It was on caretaker function since Jerry Butts left in February. So I think they're going to be taking a whole look at the Prime Minister's staff. I would expect a huge amount of advisors from the West, and they'll be bringing in special advisors, I would most likely imagine.
But how, okay, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, but how does that cut it? Because already the West obviously been saying the one or two ministers we had weren't listening to us, weren't enough, we're angry, we're voting Conservative massively. Manon, what's the magic solution?
Me, I will not exclude picking up senators, because even if they say they're independent, that's even better for Mr. Trudeau, because then he can say, okay, which senator, independent senator, have been a real voice for the West, have used his independence to speak for the West.
Yeah.
And then look at that person and say, do you want them to be this voice in cabinet? And I don't know well those senators, so I cannot pick a name and tell you, oh, maybe this one or this one. But I will not exclude the idea that maybe we'll look at who are from the West in the Senate, and that can be a team player.
And as you say, you consider it not necessarily a disadvantage that it be an independent
No.
senator. A lot of people have focused obviously on the Liberals, people who are still Liberals, but they're not Liberal members of the Liberal caucus, like Grant Mitchell, who is an Alberta senator who is a Liberal.
Can I toss in an idea that is totally not mine? I'll give him credit. Joel Denis, our colleague from La Presse, we were just talking about this earlier this morning, and his idea is, steal it, whatever, anybody who's watching, that the two premiers, Saskatchewan, Moe and Kenny, should hold elections for senators in their provinces, and Trudeau should commit to appoint them to cabinet, which would be an interesting idea.
Well, I mean, Alberta already has had some Senate elections. They haven't been really validated because turnout's been low, and they weren't official elections. They weren't sort of recognized as such, so it's not totally out of left field or right field or whatever, west
Kind of
field.
a cool idea.
I mean, certainly it's an option for him, but he has to weigh a whole bunch of factors in who he thinks he can also trust. I mean, obviously, putting someone around the cabinet table has to be someone that this government also can have a lot of trust in.
Yeah, but he needs somebody soon.
Yeah.
So you cannot wait for all this process to go on. That's why I think the group of the independent senator, they can look at a person that use his or her independence to talk, to be the voice of his or her region, like they are supposed to do.
Yeah, and then some of the independent senators are also making that argument. They're saying, look, we are a regional representation. We are more regional and more independent than we've ever been. So I guess we'll know if Manon's theory is right if we start to see the telephones ringing off the hooks in the independent senators' offices. The other question, this is the week's end, and people have had 4 days already now to talk about this, but I want you to weigh in on it, and that is how you see the first weeks and months of this government playing out, and especially a minority government, how you see Justin Trudeau getting support from whom and under what conditions?
If you'd asked me that question on election night, I would have had a very different answer than I will today, because on election night, all of the leaders were, I thought, thumbing their noses at the idea of cooperation. They were all giving victory speeches and said they all actually lost in this election, as far as I'm concerned. Mr. Trudeau started to show some signs of conciliation on Wednesday, I guess it was, when he had his first press conference. He said he regrets what happened in the election, that he hears that Canadians have sent him a message. He knows he has to cooperate. We have not seen that from him, when in fact the most telling moment in that whole thing was when someone said, well, can you point to one time in your government when you compromised? And he couldn't, or at least he didn't, which suggests that he couldn't. So he has a big challenge ahead of him. We're going to see, obviously, cabinet. I don't anticipate Parliament coming back until after the new year. Very likely, it's certainly possible in December, but he can hold off until January and sort of work with the other parties and figure out what their priorities are. That said, nobody's eager to go to an election right away, so I don't think the throne speech is going to be this big, oh my gosh, is the government going to fall?
Okay, Susan, weigh in.
We've seen, I agree with me, we've seen some interesting signs that Trudeau is listened to the criticism, and it was coming from Liberals too on election night, that he was far too triumphal. And I do think that a lot of the skills that he used as a majority prime minister are not much use now. So he's going to have to learn to love the House of Commons. He doesn't like being there.
But in terms of dance partners, who are going to be his dance partners? Because, I mean, I'm quite intrigued by the dynamic with the Bloc versus the NDP. We know that the Greens, their 3 members, cannot make or break the government in terms of survival.
Singh, I think, is the obvious one.
Yeah.
But I don't think, I think Manon is right. I think he's gonna.
Well, it depends on the dance.
Yeah.
If you want to do, you will tango with one, waltz with the other, and twist with the other.
And tax
That's
cuts are
depend
his
of the
first.
issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tax cuts
It will
are his
be.
first.
There's no coalition. And it's not a tradition anyway at the federal level. And in most minority parliament, government were able to rely on one partner just because the differential was not that big for a majority, and usually it was easier to handle. But you saw Mr. Harper, he didn't play cooperation, he played intimidation.
Yeah.
But with that, he intimidate one, intimidate the other.
Yeah.
So once he was the bloc that hold him there, and the other one time was the Liberals.
Yeah.
So it's because the interests are so diverse, he can play it differently. But it's sure that his natural allies are more the NDP and maybe the Bloc on some issues. Especially climate change is all his allies are. It's all parties except the Conservative.
He also, interestingly, got a better result for a minority to survive longer than some expected. If he'd only gotten 135 seats or so and needed even two parties to tango with, for keeping the dance metaphor going, it might have been harder. But he has a pretty significant minority government in terms of the number of seats. He really only needs one party, the NDP or potentially the Bloc, to get that. And the Conservatives need all of them to sort of to join them, and they don't have any sort of natural allies with the others. And so the other thing, of course, that throws everything into this is what happens with leadership. I mean, obviously, the other parties are questioning where they go from here. I mean, Mr. Scheer is going to face a leadership challenge potentially in April. They have to decide whether they're going to have a leadership vote anyway. His attention is all going to be on surviving that. And so for the Conservatives right now, their focus isn't going to be about bringing government down in January or on the throne speech. They're going to be thinking about, do we keep this leader? Do we continue down this path? And the NDP in many ways are going to have the same question.
Yeah, and we will be able to measure the spirit of cooperation of Mr. Trudeau, that if he used that context to, if he take advantage of that context to try to pass poison pills or not, because Mr. Harper did that number of times. Is he going to do that, or he will try to create a spirit of cooperation in avoiding putting, poison pill?
Mia raises the juiciest issue that comes out of any election, and that is where do the leaders go? Are they wounded? Are they staying on? Are they going to be reaffirmed? I want to get to that in a minute, but just before I forget, I do want Mia had because it's a question that everyone in Ottawa is asking. When do you think Parliament will return? This is pure speculation, but Susan.
I had thought December. I'm starting to believe, like everybody else, that it is January because of the length of time. And Trudeau's got to disappear for a summit in December as well. I think international affairs might keep him a bit busy, so it could be January.
Your guess?
I think the two hypotheses are still on. Especially if in December he does only a really short speech of the throne to introduce his tax cut
and
that he had promised, and it's a way to start
and Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Blanchet is pressing him for compensation, agricultural compensation for
and
the dairy producers.
This is a real issue in Quebec and in Ontario for people on the...
So leadership questions. Let's get back to it. Mr. Scheer, what do you make of it?
Definitely it's out there. He's being very bullish on his own leadership, which tells you two things this week told me that there's trouble there. One is Stephen Harper phoning around and telling people to be calm. When you've got Stephen Harper telling people to be calm, that implies that yes. So Stephen and how bullish and as Mia said, he's acting like he won on election night, and the march continues, and I won a popular vote. He's doing all kinds of interviews, so I think Scheer realizes he needs to get out in front of something right now. So I'd say that's on.
I know your feelings about it.
I think Mr. Scheer will be concentrating on his leadership review because there's a lot of people that are critical of him. He did a bad campaign. He let a lot of issues fester instead of take them right on and put a lid on them.
He has Quebec voices speaking against him.
Yeah, and so I think, yes. I think he's the only leader that is in difficulty right now or have a challenge in front of him.
Now, one leader may not be in difficulty, but she's already announced that she doesn't think she'll be around in 4 years' time if the election goes 4 years, if this government lasts 4 years, is Elizabeth May. Was anyone surprised by that?
No, I mean, she'd started to hint about that before the election.
She almost gave her job to Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Yeah, she'd offered it.
She, in some ways, had sort of suggested that she was sticking around this long as leader because she was the only MP, and so
Yeah.
she came out of this election with 2 more MPs that theoretically could take over. They have now their first MP elected outside of British Columbia. Obviously, Paul Manley still was re-elected in Nanaimo, so there's options there for her. But she's been signaling for a while that her time as the leader was almost over.
Just another prediction, and then we will keep the tape and play this back to you. Prediction in terms of the longevity of this government, and I know the answer is time will tell, but the longevity of this minority government.
Stephen Harper's minority governments lasted about 2.5 years. I know the Conservatives were sort of looking during the election when they were talking about looking forward, and if the Liberals won, that this was a 2-campaign effort for them, and they were looking that they would be prepared to run again in 18 months. Of course, what happens with Mr. Scheer in April might change that, but I would say somewhere around the two-year mark at least. I would
Okay,
imagine.
That's the average. I would think around the 2 years mark, 18 to 24 months.
Okay, Monsieur
Yeah.
Blanchet, Yves-François Blanchet says he's ready to support the government for several
Not
years.
support. He said we're ready to work
work.
for a full mandate. If they do a full mandate, that's it.
And if Mr. Trudeau cooperates and shows signs of cooperation, then there might not be any reason for the NDP or the Bloc to bring him
Susan,
down.
your prediction.
Depends on whether Mr. Trudeau thinks he's done or whether he thinks he's going to come back with a majority. And I think as soon as he sees a chance to get a majority, as his dad did back in, he went from majority to minority back to majority, I think that may be animating his thinking.
You also have Canadians who are very loathsome, we'll use, about this particular election, and I don't think would be eager to support anybody that forced an election anytime in the near future. They want to see them sort of learn their lessons and cooperate and come back and get to work. They don't want another campaign.
Public mood being so buoyant as it is. Okay, well, all three of you, thank you very much. It has been a long week, and it's been a long several weeks, and I want to thank you for coming in, sharing your thoughts.
A
Thank
pleasure.
you.